In the last episode of this series, we found that Jimmie Johnson would win his second championship under the playoff format. This made Johnson the first repeat champion under the playoff format. So now, in the 8th episode of this 13-part series, we'll see how the 2011 season would have played out with the playoff system in place. Remember that this is just a hypothetical situation. I know they would have raced differently if they had this system in place in 2011. This is just for fun. So, with that being said, let's take a look at the 2011 NASCAR Sprint Cup Series playoff grid. Now, with Trevor Bayne winning the first race at Daytona, he wouldn't be the first that would get into the playoffs because he was registered as an Xfinity driver. So, the first driver who would lock in his spot would be Jeff Gordon, with his wins at Phoenix, Pocono, and Atlanta. Carl Edwards locked in his spot with a lone Vegas win. Kevin Harvick chiseled in his spot with dramatic fashion in his triumphs in Auto Club, Martinsville, Charlotte, and Richmond. Matt Kenseth's return to victory lane at Texas and Dover initiated his return into the playoffs. Jimmie Johnson's razor-thin win at Talladega got him on the grid. Kyle Busch's spot was locked in with his wins at Richmond, Kentucky, Bristol, and Michigan. Regan Smith added a wildcard element to the playoffs with his shocking upset victory at the Southern 500. Denny Hamlin's lone victory at Michigan notched him a spot in, as did Kurt Busch's win at Sonoma. David Reagan's first career win at Daytona would get him his second playoff berth. Ryan Newman's return to victory lane at New Hampshire locked him in a spot. Paul Menard's emotional win at Indianapolis would lock his first entry into the playoffs. Marcos Ambrose did the same with his first victory at Watkins Glen. And Brad Keselowski's first entry was also created as he won at Kansas, Pocono, and Bristol. So with 14 winners in the opening 26 races, that left only 2 eligible spots for drivers to qualify on points. These would be taken up by Dale Earnhardt Jr. and Tony Stewart, who barely got in over Clint Bowyer and Kasey Kahne. So, with bonus points in place for wins, stages, and regular season playoff spots, the playoff grid would start like this. The opening round of the playoffs would be shuffled around a bit in 2011. Chicagoland would now open up the postseason, followed by New Hampshire and Dover. Opening at Chicagoland, just about every playoff driver ran around the front and around each other in the top half of the field. Denny Hamlin was the only outlier who had real problems, and it mired him back behind everybody else. As for the other 15 drivers, their fates would be decided by fuel mileage.
Half a lap to go. Now Gordon's out of fuel.
All clear, keep coming.
You'll see Gordon there. Matt Kenseth, Jimmie Johnson, all slowing out of gas. Tony Stewart, the fuel holds up.
After barely making the playoffs off of merely points, Tony Stewart would be the first to win and lock in his spot to the round of 12. And he didn't just win once, but instead twice in a row, pulling off a fuel mileage win the next week at New Hampshire. Once again, Denny Hamlin struggled, as did Marcos Ambrose. The majority of the playoff drivers pulled away to a safe distance, the exception being the final 6 drivers. Dover would be the cutoff race for the round of 16. Immediately, fan interest would skyrocket as Dale Earnhardt Jr. would have troubles and go down pit road and have his crew look under the hood. So, as the day went on, the 88 would be on the move, closer and closer to the front. While Marcos Ambrose and Denny Hamlin would fall too far back for it to matter, Dale Jr. coming through the pack was huge for Regan Smith and Paul Menard. Even with Dale Jr. finishing back in 24th, it would still be enough for him to move on to the round of 12, and the grid would look like this. The round of 12 would take place at Kansas, Charlotte, and Talladega. Jimmie Johnson would be the first to move on to the round of 8 with a win at Kansas. Meanwhile, his teammate Jeff Gordon would have the largest loss of the day with a blown engine. After Kansas, the grid would look like this. Charlotte would guarantee another driver into the round of 8 with a win in Matt Kenseth. The playoff field showed well, with only locked-in driver Jimmie Johnson not finishing inside the top half of the field. Unfortunately, the 2 lower drivers would be the 2 lowest in points, Jeff Gordon and Dale Earnhardt Jr. Heading into the ultimate wildcard of Talladega, the standings rolled out like this. Talladega would be nearly the polar opposite of Charlotte.
Curtis Markham, we've got a crash, guys.
Ryan Newman spinning off the tri-oval. Caution flag.
Everything's working against.
Oh, no, trouble. Allmendinger turned around. Kyle Busch makes contact. More cars involved. Harvick is in it, one of the championship drivers.
And would have to chase it up the track, and you're right,
Wow.
that was really hard lick there at the end.
With a crash coming out in the closing laps, it would go down to a green-white checkered finish. Between crashes, lack of stage points, and placement on the racetrack, Ryan Newman, David Reagan, and Dale Earnhardt Jr. all would have to have miracle wins to advance, and they would fail at that. But one driver, Jeff Gordon, was looking to lock in his spot. Locked in a tight battle with Brad Keselowski and now Kurt Busch, a win would be a surefire way to both lock in his own spot while eliminating at least one dangerous championship foe.
I think Matt's wanting to be able to help the 21 maybe right now. Leave Jeff Gordon hung out right here.
There it is. Goodbye, 24.
Gordon would fall back to 27th in the final results. With Brad Keselowski in 4th, it meant that the Blue Deuce was good to go. The loss of over 20 points for Gordon also meant that Kurt Busch would be safe to continue as well. So, with 4 races left on the season, the grid would look like this with a reset again. The round of 8 would consist of races at Martinsville, Texas, and Phoenix. Martinsville immediately shook up the playoff field.
As far as the time to fill it all. Ooh, how about that? A little chain reaction.
Yep.
Is this one going to boil? Yep.
All around now.
Caution. After the race for 9th and 10th gone wrong a little while ago. 8th, 9th, and 10th, excuse me.
With Kurt Busch, Brad Keselowski, and Matt Kenseth all having disappointing finishes, they all would be over 20 points out of the top 4. Carl Edwards' lack of bonus points also bit him finally, as his 9th place run put him 25 behind the cut line. Meanwhile, up front, Tony Stewart became the first driver to lock in his spot to Miami by winning, so after Martinsville, the grid would go out like this. The Texas weekend would throw a wrench into what seemed like a surefire Final Four.
Ooh, close. Wide into turn 4. That moves Kyle Busch all the way up the racetrack. He has to catch it. Avoiding the wall. And Hornaday catches the wall.
Caution's out, caution's out.
Caution is going to come out. Both drivers trying to get by. Looked like the 17 of Timothy Peters. They slid up the racetrack, and now Kyle Busch not happy at all.
It's all good, dude.
And Kyle Busch is going to turn over and 3 to the wall. Championship contender Hornaday in the wall.
For Kyle Busch's actions, NASCAR suspended him for the weekend, meaning that he would be behind the 8 ball at Phoenix. In the Cup race itself, Kurt Busch's poor finish put him in a dire position after Texas, as did Brad Keselowski's, while Tony Stewart won again. 2 drivers helped their chances behind Stewart in getting to the championship 4, with Carl Edwards finishing 2nd and Matt Kenseth finishing 4th. So heading into the desert, the grid would shape out like this. The Desert Jewel would be a different kind of animal this time around, as the track had been reconfigured since the last race in February. Some, like Carl Edwards, picked up to it well. His second straight second-place run locked in his spot to Homestead, while Kurt Busch and Brad Keselowski would officially be eliminated with their subpar runs. Kyle Busch would be out after losing an engine, leaving the final spot to be battled between Kevin Harvick and Matt Kenseth, only for that to be gone by the 200-lap mark.
You can see Matt, he had his
Okay, Matt's
on
gonna
the
be
break.
fine.
Yeah, Matt was basically going
We're
to let him
jumped
get by.
here, Jimmy.
And Brian Vickers, with whom he tangled pretty severely a couple of races ago at Martinsville.
With Casey Kane winning, no one could pull a surprise win and steal it, meaning that the Final Four would be Tony Stewart, the driver who barely made the top 16, Carl Edwards, the consistent one who was on top of the points for a lot of the year, Kevin Harvick, looking for his 2nd title, and Jimmie Johnson, the constant threat for the championship and the defending champion. Early on, Carl Edwards was the dominant driver, with Kevin Harvick not too far behind. Tony Stewart, on the other hand, ran into trouble.
You see the 14 team of Tony Stewart feverishly working on the front of their car. Stewart has hit something and it has put a big hole in the front of the grill, although Tony indicated he did not recall hitting anything at all, said he didn't feel as though he had hit any debris, but there's a hole about twice the size of a man's fist there in the front. So they're replacing the fencing part of the grill, which they also have to double check and make sure there's no debris inside the grill area as well. Now you see the replacement area, the area that they're going to replace, and now the fenced, the grill area that's being used to substitute and replace. They've also got to make sure that they get the tape on the new grill.
Jimmy Johnson ran in the back part of the top 10 before a carburetor issue ended his championship fight as well. Meanwhile, Tony Stewart put on a show for the ages.
By American Ethanol. Stewart out of line, quickly on the move in turn one.
Look at Stewart to the high side this time, 4 wide. Not finished yet. Wow.
Stewart to the bottom, 3 wide for the race lead.
3 wide, you're bottom, still 3 wide.
Maybe 4 as the 99 comes down the back straightaway here.
Kyle Busch and Keselowski not giving in. Stewart by Busch. Here's Edwards trying to keep pace.
Oh, that's close. Look at Stewart drive that car. Wow.
Stewart by Keselowski to the lead.
That's 4 fresh tires working right there.
Edwards racing with 2 for second and trying to keep up. 2002, he was the champion. 2005, he was the champion, those driving for someone else. This time, he's an older driver, and he's going to become a 3-time NASCAR Sprint Cup champion. Tony Stewart wins it.
Tony Stewart will be the 2011 NASCAR Sprint Cup Series playoff champion, stringing together 5 wins over the final 10 races. The 2011 playoffs would be only the second to match up with reality, and the first to have the same top 3 in the playoff setting that it did in real life. The Final Four actually had the fewest amount of wins in the Final Four's history with 12. 5 from Stewart, 4 from Harvick, 2 from Johnson, and a lone win from Carl Edwards. As for the top 16 in total, 15 of them would score wins during the season, the highest in the playoffs' history. Dale Earnhardt Jr. was the only winless driver in the playoffs. Of the top 10 in real life, Jr. also was the only to finish outside the top 10 in the playoffs, as he finished 12th. He would be replaced by Kyle Busch in the top 10. The highest non-chaser was Paul Menard, who finished 13th in points. He was one of the 4 drivers to make their inaugural appearance into the playoffs, with himself, Regan Smith, Marcos Ambrose, and Brad Keselowski. 5 drivers once again kept their now 8-year streak alive of making the playoffs every year, these being Tony Stewart, Jimmy Johnson, Matt Kenseth, Jeff Gordon, and Kurt Busch. Now, I knew before this series had even started that this year was going to mirror reality almost perfectly. I kept this in, 1, because it's fun to make, and 2, because I think that this season was the catalyst in what NASCAR's championship is today. So, with this all being said now, I want to pass it on to you. What do you think about the 2011 NASCAR playoffs? Let me know down in the comments below, leave a like, and sub for more great NASCAR content. And until next time, have a good one.